hajime!
Good evening, Legionaries. This is General Lance, Sergeant Barnes at the War Room, and we're joined today by a very special friend of mine, austere and intrepid man of great boots. Welcome to the War Room, the Warrior Philosopher. How are you doing, Pat?
Doing excellent. And, I've always wondered, Sergeant Barnes is very quiet. And I've heard other people bring this up before. How do you communicate? Like, does he understand English, or do you have to use sign language?
Oh, so how we communicate is actually through drinking, and usually at the end of the bottle, he starts talking. So that's how it works.
Okay, gotcha. Maybe we'll eventually get a glimpse one day.
Yeah, like a good
future.
NCO, he communicates with me telepathically. That's how it works. Okay.
Very, very based.
Well, you and I, we've been, obviously following each other for a while, and I'm grateful to have come across in our paths together. And I think we've really resonated on a number of levels regarding multiple different stuff. But I think the Legionaries, they would like to know more about you, and so would I. And I think it's a good place to start here. Just tell us about how your Warrior Philosopher channel began, how your basic writing projects began, and just tell us more about you, how this all started.
For sure. So I'd say, from a young age, I'd always been interested in military history. My dad would, before I went to bed, he would tell me about the Battle of Thermopylae, and he'd talk about like the Peloponnesian Wars and all these different things. He got me the Dangerous Book for Boys as a kid, and they have all the famous battles of history. I think they were like Waterloo, Crécy, Cannae. So I was always interested in that. I would play with beads as a child and pretend these like hundreds of beads were soldiers on a battlefield, legions clashing against Germanic barbarian tribes. And from there, going through life, doing martial arts was a big contributor to the sort of warrior way, so to speak. And then after high school, so I went to an all-boys Catholic high school, very preppy, full of all these bourgeois, rich, wealthy kids who were destined to go to great private colleges and whatnot. And nobody had joined the military out of high school for 5 years from the school I went to. And I was a little bit of a rebel. This was like my Ernst Jünger joining the French Foreign Legion moment. I was like, I'm gonna go join the Marine Corps. So did that. Now nearing my service, got a lot of great memories. And then I would say for the Warrior Philosopher, the actual channel, and I do think it is directly related to being in the military, because I had a buddy, one of my best friends, and we started this little club, so to speak, amongst other military guys. And it was just, we would talk about politics and stuff like that. We planned, and for a few times we had like meetings at my place and got drunk and talked about shit. And from there, I had this moment. It was the same best friend. We were going camping, and maybe this is just a silly psychological event, but I remember that night I had the craziest dreams ever. We were high up in the mountains, nobody around for miles. And I was having these crazy ass dreams and shit. And I don't know if it's related, but about a week later, I started the Warrior Philosopher channel. And it was sort of this culmination of this feeling within me to want to start contributing to something politically. And it started off very basic, all the Stoic type stuff, very normie things. And then I came across a man by the name of Friedrich Nietzsche, who I had known a bit about for a while, but really started getting into shortly after making the channel. From there, you get into guys like Ernst Jünger, who I was recommended by another good friend of mine who was part of that said club. And from there, Mishima, Spangler, all these different guys. And here I am today, being able to join you on this auspicious afternoon to discuss what are we going to do with this knowledge, what are we going to do with this feeling and this zeitgeist, you know?
You know, they talk about your background, and I think the zeitgeist of our time is, well, I mean, only until recently, something that's really focused on, you know, I don't know if you've ever watched this movie Office Space.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you know how it's like this very bugman, sterile life, you know, this echo of a life. It's not even, when people say, for instance, there's a crisis of masculinity or something, I don't even consider that. I think there's just a crisis of life because women aren't women and men aren't men, and you see people are confused, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but like levels of depression are skyrocketing, especially amid women. And I think a number of other different factors of the decline of vitality and the will itself, the will to impose one's values upon others without caring if it makes people uncomfortable or, you know, cry or whatever. And basically a general philosophy of pain aversion. And what I mean by pain aversion is that liberalism is predicated on maximizing, you know, pleasure and minimizing pain. And I think we're starting to understand that the extremis of this formula is that pleasure without pain turns to ash in your mouth. And so, you know, we came out of the 1990s extremely rich, with no sense of great, you know, spiritual crucible, no personal challenges, which truly, you know, I guess place us at odds at a greater cause or whatever. And so basically we're a generation, especially Gen Z and younger, are in this kind of morass where the older generations care about just money and about themselves, and they're realizing how hollow and empty that all is. And so I guess what I wanted to ask you, you're someone that comes from a very interesting background, obviously from an affluent background with, you know, wide scope of cultural scope. And secondarily, I think that you come from a background which would, in other words, how do you say, it would reward someone who would go down the orthodox path of,
Correct.
you know, being, oh, I could be a banker, I could do X, Y, and Z. If I'm a quiet little good boy, I do, you know, the usual path. I'll end up at 50, 60 with a wife and 2.5 kids or whatever, and then retire and die on a cruise line, right? Like a boomer.
Yeah.
And so I guess one of the most pertinent questions is, why is it that you changed up? Why did you choose to risk your neck, put your face out there, and, you know, really, I guess, take the banner of the Legion, you know, against, you know, especially because nowadays, like, if you're not a liberal, you're like Satan himself, you know. So I guess I wanted to ask you, like, what is it that really kind of enthralled you to live in a life of danger and adventure?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different things. Like, I think honestly, the biggest reason is, you know, I love my dad, but he's always been a bit of a prick in terms of like not being satisfied with things I do. So he always pushed me to do more in life. So I've never been the kind of person that was satisfied with things. And I think there's something that Bap talks about in Bronze Age Mindset, which is very pertinent. And he talks about the kind of sort of politically sensitive man, so to speak. And growing up, and he talks about how, for example, masculinity today is in a very weird spot where a lot of it takes place in controlled space. So, for example, athletics, so you're kind of like a jock lifestyle, right? It's within a controlled space rather than the sort of open space that you would have gotten hundreds of years ago when you're out on the frontier, conquering new lands, whatever. And, you know, obviously he also alludes to the modern bugman. I think I ended up in a position where I didn't quite resonate with the bugman, obviously, you know, and no explanation needed there, but I also didn't resonate quite so much with the traditional jock, so to speak. It all felt very artificial, and the sort of life I was living felt very artificial because you have all these people coming from, you know, very affluent backgrounds, and, you know, my family was decently well off, like upper middle class, but nowhere near as rich as most of the people that went to the school. But I saw the kind of lives they lived, this very sort of bourgeois existence, and it just felt fake to me. And I had all this, like, you know, PC liberal culture in high school. All the teachers, were part of that sort of very leftist progressive model, especially because I went to a Jesuit school. And if you are familiar with the sort of different orders, the Jesuit order has been traditionally quite left wing. So there's a lot of that influence, and it just felt so fake to me. And I just felt like I had to break out of it some way. And yeah, I could have gone to school, did the 2.5 child lifestyle, which, mind you, is a very optimistic outlook that these people are going to be having 2.5 children. Maybe wouldn't be so screwed if they actually did, but I just couldn't do it, and it just felt so fake. And I wanted something real. I felt that with pain came reality. That's something I learned from martial arts. There's something that felt good about pain and triumph, right? Like I think I mentioned this to you before in a conversation we had, like the one thing that's like better than sex, even better than all these different physical pleasures, is victory. And I never felt better than I ever had when I won a wrestling match or won a jiu-jitsu tournament or like won an MMA fight. And I think that's why I joined the military, is because it to me resembled something of pain and suffering, something real that I could attain if I went down that path.
Of course, and obviously I saw some pictures of you. You're Chad. You have a number of first place and high runner-up tournament belts. That's pretty freaking sick, dude. It's fucking metal.
Indeed, I had some good times in high school with competition.
Good to go. Fucking sick. No, that's awesome, and I think you're starting to see this more and more. Is that people are not satisfied with the huge, and I think people see, statistically speaking, males generally dropping out of the workforce or whatever, and I don't think it has really much to do with the basic considerations which most people, how do you say this? Most people like usually do. Like, for instance, it's like they're males are, if you listen to leftists, males are finally being competed against women in a equal environment. They can't stand it. It's like, all right, that's also bullshit. But also conversely, even if we're all male environment, how incredibly fake and low stakes everything is. I mean, take for instance, you go to a financial board, and the majority of individuals who are incredibly competitive are males. But it's also like this fake male, like these people who haven't been pressed against, the great risk of life. They're not great like condottieri or something. They're just risking money, and they're people like risking other people's money, and they end up losing a lot of money. And it's just like some of them end up, obviously offing themselves, but it's not the same. It's not the same dynamic, right? It's not
No,
like
yeah.
back in the day you're an adventurer faring the seas or going over the hill and conquering someone else's foe, and you either it's either victory or death for you and your loved ones and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's what people are really getting like sick of. And Nietzsche talks about
Yeah.
that man would rather will to nothingness than will nothing at all. And I think that's what people are seeing now, is that like people really really hate this this paradigm that we're in, where it's just like societal stagnation. It mirrors this mouse experiment from back in yonder days, like I think it was the 60s, 70s, and 80s, which had to do with basically a mouse utopia where mice were put in a colony, and ultimately the abstract of the experiment was done over iterations. So it's many different types. It's not just one sample size. It's like a large sample size. But rats are exposed to a colony in which they have everything they need. They have food, water, shelter, company, everything they could possibly want, right? But over time, rats basically became asocial. The lack of competition, the lack of mental tension psychologically caused rats to become asocial. So some became incredibly fat. Others became what is called incels. They would only venture out at night. Others became incredibly asocial, antisocial, rather, ravenous for each other's rat meat and doing crazy crap. Female rats weren't able to bring their children to term, so they would give birth to dead rats, and the ones
Jesus.
that would survive, the female or feminine instincts that usually had taken over from their ancestors would deteriorate, and over time they would just be either abandoned their young, or outright kill them or starve them. And ultimately every colony, every experiment of this utopia would ultimately end up in the same situation.
Hmm.
Total, like, societal population collapse. And obviously this is a rat, this is a different species, but I think they're close enough to us to actually mimic a lot of the different social, psychological needs that humans need. And
Hmm.
if you ask a liberal what people need, is, oh, you need more money, you need to be more comfortable, you need to be more happy, you just need to be more happy, okay, you just need to fill your face with drugs and food, and that's what you need. No, 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 my friends. My friends, what you need is danger. What you need is to strive after things that are beyond your grasp and constantly seek and conquer. Where people don't have that psychological tension, that is where the fall is. That's where the cycle of
Hmm.
decadence becomes. And people are like, I remember in college talking to people about decadence writ large, and to their mind, it comes this stupid Christian mindset, which is
Hmm.
this almost half truth, which is,
Yeah.
yes, they're talking about, wealth being an excess, but they do it in such a way which is like really lame. But
Yeah, the ascetic way.
exactly, exactly. And what ends up happening is the same outcome as does, excess and hedonism. No, no, no. The
Hmm.
truth is that there needs to be this agonal, you know, tension.
Yes.
I guess what I'd say, a competition against individuals that doesn't exist in a utopia. When there's a superabundance of goods, there is societal collapse, because ultimately what humans really, really need is that agonal spiritual fucking, like, difficulty to flourish.
Hmm.
And I guess I wanted that's a really long-winded caveat to explain
Yeah.
what your kind of vision of life is, maybe putting words in your mouth. But
Hmm.
how do you feel about that kind of observation? Is that something that you yourself have perceived?
Yeah, I mean, I know we talked about the rat experiment before offline as well, so I'm now familiar with it. And I think because you brought up like things like Office Space, I think that's actually a brilliant example of this. Movies like Office Space and Fight Club, where you have these guys that, for the most part, have a fairly comfortable existence, right? They have a good existence by liberal bourgeois standards. They live in nice houses, they have money, they have all the comforts at their disposal. In Fight Club, he has the IKEA nest, right, where he has the coffee table with the yin yang, and the uh, the imperfect plates made by the people of wherever, right? So it's like they're all comfortable. They all have what they need, and yet they're in a state of spiritual neurosis. And when you ask me, like, what did I feel? Why did I go towards this life of pain and struggle or whatever? I think that I did have exposure to life in a way that most people didn't have.
Hmm.
So for me personally, it wasn't like I was really myself breaking out of anything, but it's more like seeing the paths laid out for me. I knew if I went down a specific path, I would never be satisfied within it because of the artificiality that I witnessed and observed. So, like, what I'm getting at is you have people like the narrator in Fight Club or Office Space, and I think it's absolutely as you're describing in this state of abundance. They don't have that struggle that really invokes a feeling of life. And you mentioned like the ascetic way is just as bad as the hedonistic way if you take it to its extremes. And this is why Nietzsche in Will to Power says you should seek pleasure and pain in turn. If you only seek pleasure, obviously you're going to be the hedonist, and you're ultimately it's going to turn to ash in your mouth, like you mentioned. But if you're also the extreme ascetic and you try to deny life entirely, you become a preacher of death. Oh, the real life is outside of this life. Then it's like, why are you living at all? Why not just do the bare minimum if you're just living for something else afterwards? And this is why the idea of Elysium, the Isles of the Blessed, Valhalla are so powerful, is because you can't just be mediocre within like the Hellenic pagan faith or the Norse pagan faith. No, you have to go out of your way to live an extraordinary life, to have that reward, which is why ultimately those faiths are not ascetic, and they have this balance, this sort of mix of Apollonian and Dionysian, the almost tragic element of the Homeric epics that Nietzsche is so fond of. And all that to say, if you remember in the Office Space, I know you like to bring that up a lot, and it's like even in their rebellion, the rebellion against the system is so castrated.
Yeah.
Like, what do? They break a bunch of computers and shit. They steal some money from their company. Even their rebellion, which we see as like, oh my God, look at this. Like the fact that that is considered high rebellion in this sort of post-industrial society is insane, because it's really nothing when you think about it. They broke a couple of machines, and they very nervously stole money from their company. It's like, which is why I like Fight Club. Obviously, Fight Club's a lot less realistic, right? Very fantastical, avant-garde even in some ways. But they just want to bleed, right? All they want is pain, because they want to feel something real. They want to bleed just to know that they are actually living. So what do? They get the shit beat out of them every Saturday, and it's a very beautiful thing when you think about it. Like, people just want pain. People want to feel. People want to live.
Yes.
It's not about comfort. It's not about happiness. They just want to live.
Yes, and I think that's what people really take for granted is, and I think this is why I'm an acolyte of Nietzsche, or rather maybe a champion would be a better word, because he would hate an acolyte,
Yes.
but I'm certainly his champion. And the reason why is because ultimately one of the most counterintuitive things is that in the generations before him, especially if you trace the good life being the relation to pain, for instance, of the Socratics being indifferent, so the Stoics seeing pain and pleasure as indifference, which is probably the closest approximation to us. And then, of course, you see Eudomists and hedonists. They perceive pleasure to be the highest good and to minimize pain. I think both of these are mistakes in their own way by differing degrees, and I think truly Nietzsche hits it on the head that the further into pain you go, the deeper you become spiritually. And what does that mean? You become someone of immense gravitas, you know what I mean? And the Greeks, you spoke about the Homerics, and I think it's important not to stay in the contemporary era with these movies, because in 50, 100 years, people are going to forget Fight Club. People are going to forget Office Space. I mean, hell, very few people actually know of it, but no one forgets Homer. No one forgets Troy. And the reason why they don't forget it is because ultimately, if you read the Iliad, it is nothing but the acclaim, the affirmation of the aesthetic value of tragedy, of life being thrown into this fiery, constant contest, and that pain is the sacrament which makes everything beautiful. Even the death of many of the great champions, either Diomedes and so on, it's always adorned in this beautiful understanding of life, and that the twin of pain is always this higher being than simply euphoria. It's fulfillment. It's fullness. And I guess that's why I'm trying to talk about and champion Nietzsche, because I think through Nietzsche, of course, he's not an end, he's a beginning. But it's through Nietzsche that we reacquaint ourselves, just as Jung talked about. Tell me about your relation to pain, I'll tell you who you are. And you can see the reason why the West is falling nowadays and people are so weak is because ultimately it has to do with people's acquaintance and relation to pain. Most people's highest acclaim is to be happy, but they don't even know what that means. And they ascribe happiness to this superficial feeling of what do you say? I guess, like I say, euphoria, but it's not a true spiritual catharsis. Now, I guess I wanted to ask you, you talk about Junger as well, and
Yes.
obviously you had a arc when it came to the Warrior Philosopher with your channel specifically, and I wanted to ask you, what is it that made your arc bend? From where you started was very normal, and I guess I wanted to ask you, what was that catalyst that made you arc out?
Yeah, so I think in a sense, what is it? Is it van der Vogel or Wunderwall? The sort of outdoor movement that you
van der
was a part
Vogel,
of.
yeah, Vogel, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess that for me was like martial arts, right? Like it was a slight rebellion against this sort of catatonic life I saw. I don't know. I would say the first instance of like me really taking a step towards a philosophy of action, let's say, or just seeking that pain that you don't get in a sort of in the sort of modern world within controlled space. The sort of spiritual neurosis is through combat, right? So I remember I was in I tried to get on the basketball team at my school, but like if I'm not a great basketball player. I'm like 5'9". I was like 5'6" at the time since I was a freshman in high school, maybe 5'5", skinny guy. I was never making the team, so I had just failed the tryouts for the team, and I was like, well, I need a new sport to play. And I was in an English class, and the wrestling coach comes in as a substitute, and he's trying to recruit people for the wrestling team. And I'm like, well, I did karate as a kid, that didn't really count. I'm like, I really want to know how to fight, so I was like, okay, sign up for the wrestling team. And shortly after that, I remember I became a fan of Conor McGregor, and I think it was still my freshman year. I got sick for like a 2-week long period, like really sick, and all I did all day was just watch MMA all the time, especially Conor McGregor. And I started thinking like, I can be this guy who can just defeat people and impose my will on them, so to speak. And it's like you have this feeling of a philosophy of action that you can't put into words. And just beginning with martial arts, I think that was sort of the introduction to what ends up being this journey that I'm on today. But the second biggest, I think, sort of impact on my life was when I was trying to figure out, well, what was I going to do after high school? And of course, all my friends were applying to colleges and stuff like that. I kind of indirectly self-sabotaged my high school career because I hated school. And it's not like, obviously I wasn't dumb or anything, but I hated it. It was so boring to me. Like I just wanted to do shit. I just couldn't wait for school to end so I could go train at the gym. So I was like, I don't want to go to college. And I think, I was a big fan of military movies. I had seen Letters from Iwo Jima, Black Hawk Down, all of that. And of course, it's Hollywood to a large extent, but I did see that sort of vitality and that willingness to sacrifice, that willingness to put yourself up for something greater than yourself. And obviously, a lot of that is sort of subdued in the modern military. And that's something that I think is up to people like us to change in the long term, is to return that vitality to it. But ultimately, that was the best path for me to take, rather than go to college or rather than find some bullshit job. Was I was going to do something that could lead me to experience pain. I forget what they call it in one of the pamphlets for like the Marine Corps recruitment. It's like, you're going to be reborn in fire or something like that, shed your false sense of self, and all those things appealed to me. So yeah, it was right around the time where I had to decide, what are you going to do with your life? And I'm like, I don't want to go to school. I want a life of pain. I want a life of struggle. I want a life of adventure. And, I got parts of that through my service. And I'll never say I regret it, because I had a lot of great memories, met a lot of great friends, but what I definitely sought something more, and I don't think I quite fully got that, but that was the turning point. Was, what are you going to do with your life? You have to ultimately take a step in one direction or another. You can't just wait for life to come at you. So yeah,
exactly. And I know this sounds kind of cringe, but there's this guy when I was a young kid in high school called Elliot Hulse. Are you aware of him by any chance?
I'm not, no.
So he's kind of like one of the original manosphere type guys, but I think one of the most poignant videos he came out with a long time ago was basically throw yourself in a crucible and get yourself out. And for him, it was something a little bit more tame, which is like, get yourself in a lot of debt on purpose. On purpose. Yeah,
interesting.
Actually self-sabotage and force yourself to get out of it. And his point was that putting yourself in this kind of crucible, the situation that kind of puts you at odds, with sink or swim, actually grows you. And for me, I think I was reflecting on it, and in a way I sabotaged my life on purpose, and from it became incredibly powerful from it, right? In my own way, right? I created myself perfectly, because I remember what it must have been like. You should meet most people. I mean, even high and low in society, most people don't go out on a limb. They don't take significant risks, and what ends up happening is they simply they live the life of a yeast. They just are
Hmm.
existing, and then one day they expire, and that is it. But they never lived. And I have made it my mission to live. And I think the issue with the human animal is that the human animal is such a pleasure-loving creature, that ultimately they're not able to artificially induce hardship upon themselves unless if it's necessary, right? Because we're naturally lazy, and therefore the wider society starts reflecting those natural intentions, and that it's up to leaders such as you and I to impose harsh artificial society rules, or maybe even just conditions, to make sure that we're able to make people grow and be strong beyond their original, what they may originally have been, if it weren't for the case that the times themselves made them rise to the occasion. Am I making sense? Are you tracking?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is something, I kind of thought about when you were mentioning, you're talking, we've kind of gone back and forth today and then before on that sort of quality of balance, right, between all these different factors of like these feelings in life that sort of leads to this embrasure of life that we need, right? And it's funny that you mentioned self-sabotage. That's a big Nietzschean theme, right? Like the path of down going. It's also in Fight Club. That's literally the whole plot of Fight Club, right? His all with a spoiler alert. If you're watching this podcast and you haven't watched Fight Club, then you're wrong. But spoiler anyway is like for the pretty much the entirety of the film, his alter ego is literally purposefully ruining his life. He blows up his own apartment. He gets fired from his job. Of course, he ends up with a severance pay. So I don't know if that's quite self-sabotage, but he lives in a shitty house with like hardly working plumbing, all these different things. And it's like only through losing everything are you free to do anything. Mm-hmm. That's sort of the idea behind it. And I think it's interesting. And because we're both big fans of Nietzsche, the second Nietzsche book that I completed was Birth of Tragedy. And the whole sort of thesis of that book is a critique of the shift from sort of the Homeric, the tragic, the sort of Apollonian and Dionysian aspect of Greek society to the sort of Socratic, Aesopian fable, and eventually Platonic school of thought. And I think what you get out of that is everybody feels like they have an answer to life, right? Especially once you begin with the Platonics, and of course that ends up influencing modern Christianity and all these things. It's like there is a clear answer to how to live your life, and everything will be fine. You can get rid of your earthly desires. If you just, you don't lust anymore, you'll be fine, right? And on the flip side, you have the alternate of that is if you just don't have any pain, any suffering, you'll be fine. And I think that's quite interesting that a lot of the moral philosophies that Nietzsche is critical of sort of think that they can solve all these issues that you and I are bringing up. But ultimately, life isn't ends in itself. There's no ends to life. You just have to live it. And there's a few things I wanted to bring up in regards to that. And it's like, like the old Greek saying, like, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yes.
So I'm maybe this is the wrong interpretation of it, but one interpretation I kind of thought of while we were talking is the tragedy, right? After Theseus kills the Minotaur, he forgets to put down like the white sails or whatever, and his father commits suicide. Achilles, his mother tells him, "You're going to die in Troy. You're going to die young with all this fame." Alexander dies at 32 and his empire literally crumbles after his death. You have this idea of tragedy throughout Greek history, and of course their epics as well, right? There's no quite one happy ending. There's always immense struggle and immense hardship. Orpheus looks back before he can bring his wife back to life. Like tragedy is there's no such thing as a free lunch. Life is an end of itself, and I think one of the beautiful things that Nietzsche talks about with eternal recurrence is you just have to live life for what it is, and you should have goals. You should have these ends. But it's not to satisfy yourself. It's to open yourself up even more to life. Like who lived life more than a man like Caesar, for example, who literally had victorious campaigns and triumphs and had affairs with Cleopatra. Like who really lived more than Caesar, right? So you have to expose yourself to life by seeking greatness. It's not going to ever make you satisfied. And there's this great line in the Hagakure, which is like, for those of you that don't know, it's sort of probably the most important book for the samurai. I'm sure you would agree, Lance. Wonderful book. And there's a line in there, and I'm paraphrasing. It's something along the lines of like, you should seek perfection for your entire life, but you will never actually be perfect. And I think that hits the nail on the head of precisely the sort of feeling that we have, is like, you must seek perfection, seek greatness, seek excellence, seek pain in order to receive those things, not because it's going to be some ends and it's going to be satisfied. It's not like this sort of, and of course I don't understand Hegel that much, but it's not like this Hegelian notion, history has an ends, everything will be fine, blah, blah, blah. No, we live in a state of eternal recurrence, right? Mm-hmm. You are constantly on fire, and that fire will both be painful and it will also light up the room and light up the world. So we live in a constant state of becoming. And because of this, there is no perfect end. You just have to keep living. You just have to keep seeking more and more of life and heightening that feeling of life. And there will be immense pain, but there will also be immense pleasure and reward. And that's exactly what life is.
Exactly. And I couldn't have said it better myself, because I think ultimately, I don't know, I think because of the fact that we live in such a prosperous society, that we have all kinds of pathologies and paraphilias which we consider to be advancements or whatever. And I think it's just as you said, the reintroduction of the tragic age. A tragic age is what really man longs for, because I think there's nothing. You're an author yourself and a writer, prolific writer, good writer, and I think one of the most interesting things about, I guess, creative activity, especially when it comes to plots, is that for me, all the plot lines that were never tragic in nature always seemed to ring hollow. Everyone talks about Hercules, but no one talks about Hercules' fucking ends. No one talks about, how much he suffered. No one talks about, for instance, I guess most people are acquainted with tragedy because of Oedipus and his downfall. But no one understands that, I guess Nietzsche says this in a perfect quip about life. No one listens to a melody for its end. They listen to it for its, for the melody itself, right? And I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but tragedy is so important to end in tragedy, right? Because ultimately that's how all life is. Life begins from nothing. We go back to nothing, but that doesn't mean we have to amount to nothing. And that ultimately it's the peaks of life that are begotten by adventure and seeking and exploration and extirpation of others, but also construction of new things, of new forms, of new families, whatever it may be in your life. Both these things come hand in hand, right? Our glory walks hand in hand with our doom. Isn't that what Achilles' mom said to him? I mean, it's the truth for everyone. However, most people, I guess they shirk from that because they're fundamentally cowards, right? Because they're afraid of never amounting to anything. But my friend, never having tried, that is the coldest of colds. That is a cold and timid soul, to never have gone into the arena, right? And, I think when we go into this coming era, especially Nietzsche talks about the master and the slave morality, but really what he's talking about are biological types. He's talking about the master type and the slave type. And there's a lot of talk about ethnicity. There's a lot of talk about, communism does this great job. Communism is not really an ideology. It's just a weapon. And all it does is it crushes, it's a vivisection of reality and of all organic beings, and tries to destroy everything to become equal. But I think most people don't realize that we are only equal in death. Death alone is this plane, right? This plane, this leveling of mountains, and that ultimately all excellence is predicated, or by its very nature requires there to be the higher and the lower, the many who are on bottom and the few on top. And I think it's just the iron law of life that's inescapable, and not only inescapable in a bad way, like take for granted, but I think it's good. And I think it's important to recast the role that the tragedy of life plays in our life. And I guess I wanted to kind of reiterate this because this is why you and I are talking about New Rome. But instead of, you know, I, so many people are focused on really stupid reactive ways talking about communism, whether it's about man versus woman, one ethnicity versus another, but no one talks about these spiritual castes, the warrior as who
Hmm.
sits above, and the slave who's a slave of their passions, who is a slave of their resentment. You know what I mean? Their ressentiment.
Yes.
You know,
Resentment. Yeah.
exactly. And no one talks about how you could outmaneuver this Bugman type faction by simply
Hmm.
flip it on its head and find many friends left and right of you, you know, whoever it may be, that are also of the same, how do you say, caste as one, you know,
Yes.
as a warrior. And I guess I wanted to pick your brain to how do you feel about that, and what do you think about the solutions of our modern time?
Yeah, and this is a good segue into sort of talking a little bit about our project that we're working on as well. And I just wanted to mention, because you brought up Hercules, and that's a great point, right? The Disney movie in Hercules doesn't talk about where he literally murders his wife and children, right? Because he's I forget how it happens. Some god invokes him with madness or something, right? I forget the exact story.
Me too. I
But
spoiled it. It's okay.
yeah, but like what people don't realize is actually, I mean, this might get me some flack from the Christians out there, and this is not me trying to come at the Jesus story, but in a lot of ways, the story of Jesus reflects the story of Hercules. If you think about the labors, Hercules went through, he went through like 12 labors or something like that. I might get the number wrong, but he went through these specific challenges, these specific labors, the same way that in the sort of Christian doctrine, Jesus goes through these specific labors. So a lot of similarities between the story of Jesus and the story of Hercules. And it's great that you bring this up, Hercules in specific. So the Argidae family, which is the line which eventually becomes like Philip II of Macedon and Alexander the Great, they trace their ancestry back to a man like Hercules. And of course, Hercules at the end of his life eventually becomes a god, the same way men like Romulus, Aeneas, Augustus, and Julius Caesar even, right? It's very tragic, though, the life they live, but it's a life of greatness as well. And to put yourself in that sort of what do you call it, spirit, like for example, in in the movie Forrest Gump, what's his name, Lieutenant Dan, he's like, he just wants to die in war because every one of his ancestors died in war,
Right.
and unfortunately he's robbed of the chance, but anyway, but like that reminds me of like what the Argidaes try to be. Philip II of Macedon is assassinated on the dawn of his great campaign against the Persians, right? He meets this tragic end. Alexander the Great literally, dies right before he can. He's on the precipice of greatness that goes beyond even our imaginations, and he dies in Babylon. His son is murdered by various generals that succeeded him, that are part of the successor states. His mother is murdered. His wife Roxanne is murdered. Like, there's all this tragedy. It's like, why would you want to be a part of a line of just tragedy? But you do, because walking hand in hand with tragedy is also greatness. And I think when we talk about how do we figure out this spiritual caste, right? This sort of higher ideal and this higher identity, it's precisely putting yourself in the position where you look at your ancestors, for example. Maybe they're not actually your ancestors, but a spiritual ancestor. You look at a guy like Napoleon, right? He also met a very tragic end, like he was the island of St. Helena or whatever, like it was full of these toxic fumes. He died sickly, alone, right? Like all these people that we venerate, Julius Caesar, right, was literally assassinated. Why the hell do we want to be like these people? Well, it is because tragedy walks hand in hand with greatness, and we want to create a spiritual caste or spiritual caste. Geez, I used to say caste, but ever since I started talking to you, I start saying case now. But like when we want to create that sort of new ideal and that new identity, it's by putting yourself in the tradition of pain and greatness that you see in the past. It's who you revere as your role models. The sort of Greco-Roman heroic ideal is putting these tragic heroes at the top of your society's admiration. These are the people we admire. Romulus died in battle, right? There's very few happy endings in Greco-Roman mythology, right? Like, and I don't like to call it mythology because Achilles is real and we are not. at least yet.
That's right.
And it's interesting that Nietzsche calls Jesus the one true Christian, right? Because he also has all these great struggles, and maybe it's to an ascetic end. So of course it's a lot different. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get at is what we must do with New Rome is, and you mentioned why communism is so successful. What communism does is it unites one specific class across a lot of different areas, and it weaponizes them to fight against the master class. But the problem with the master class today is that each master class differentiates itself from another master class. So for example, and this was the case of human history for like 10,000 years, everybody had the same ideology pretty much at one point in human history. It was fight for your own glory and the veneration of your own state. So you have all these, whether it's medieval kingdoms, whether it's during the Roman period where you have the Roman Empire, and you have all these different tribes, they were fighting for their self-interest. They were a bunch of societies led by a master class, a master warrior class, who were fighting against each other. Communism seeks to unite every single slave class throughout the world. That is their advantage over us, is that they can unite regardless of distinction. Whereas I think our mission going forward is finding a way to unite the military castes of the world behind an identity, to say this is not a conflict of petty distinction. The reason why you and I are imperialists, so to speak, and not nationalist, is because we have this Faustian ambition to take as much as possible in all directions. We're not satisfied with a small little hamlet of land. We're not trying to conserve anything. We're not conservatives. We're revolutionaries in the sense that we want more. We want to change things. We want to go as far as possible, right? The Faustian ambition is seeing the stars and saying there is no limit to them. We are going to keep moving forward. And I think that goes into what we want to do in New Rome is we want to build a spiritual empire, not a spiritual nation. We want something that transcends all other things before us and seeks to break out of these manufactured limits that have been constructed falsely in modernity by the liberal bourgeois class, who is afraid of something monumental that destroys the foundations of their sort of illusory society. And that's very wordy, whatever. But all that to say is we have these outlandish, outreaching goals. But to achieve that, we have to realize what is the instinct? What is the instinct of the people that we call our friends, that we call our allies? And a lot of times, petty distinction, whether it's between nation or like very specific cultural values, right? It's like in Gulliver's Travels, there's that war over the way an egg should be cooked or some shit. I can't remember exactly. Like, that's the problem of the master classes of the world, is that we let ourselves be singled out by the communists because of petty distinction, and they pick us off one by one. We need to unite as a spiritual, militaristic caste to fight against precisely that zeitgeist of the bugman, of the man of ressentiment, of the ugly, disgusting, weak, beings. That is what we must do. We must show people
the
that
botched and the broken. Yeah, of course. Yes, I agree with this, and I think, even Nietzsche attests to the fact that men of the same caste between nations have more in common with each other than they do with their lower castes. So what does that mean? So basically, the aristocratic class of, let's say, like Europe has
Japan,
has more in common with the aristocratic caste of Japan than Europeans with their own peasants. And this is where I really disagree with Spangler with his peasant veneration. I really hate that. I don't think he's ever experienced what it's like to be around a real peasant. Like, I don't know. But anyway, I think you put I don't want to tarry too long because I think you left it on a great, I guess, ledge from which we'll leap. We'll leap deep into the abyss of the human soul. We'll come out with some nugget of gold at the end of it. We'll call it Rome, and with it, we'll build something new. But this is precisely what you're talking about, which you and I will expound on later and flesh out. But I'm really glad that you came on the War Room, brother. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for sharing your attitudes with us. I think I really look forward to our program together, our mission together, and to raise those legions to conquer the stars by first conquering ourselves. Well, do you have any last minute things to say before we sign off here?
Yeah, I'll just leave it with New Rome is coming. New Rome is near. Look for the omens, look for the signs. You will see signs from Jupiter, from Mars, and together we will conquer the stars. That's all I have to say. New
Yes,
Rome, baby.
an eagle circles above head. We have propitious omens. Mars sends his
Yes.
regards.
The gods are with us.
That's right. All right, gentlemen. So thank you so much, Pat, from the Warrior Philosopher. And like I said, we'll be doing a series together, a huge project. We will be span a few years called New Rome. And on top of everything else, this is the War Room. This is Sergeant Barnes and General Lance, Lance's Legion, signing off.